Okay. You see my slides, right?
Yep, slides look good. Good, the stream's up and running. Good. We'll give everybody another minute or two to log on. There's still some people joining, and then we'll get going.
Hey, Andres.
Hey, Sam, how are you?
Good, good. I'm going to have to leave right at the end, so it's because I have a class right after this.
Okay. No worries.
So don't.
I'm doing stuff on my. Oh, wait a second.
Oops.
No.
Definitely want to get on Vanessa's Wi-Fi.
Yeah, that broke it.
Maurizio, will you be answering questions in the chat room?
Good.
Yeah, I can do that.
That's great.
All right. Nice. So send all questions to the chat room.
So you're just the face of the project.
Yeah, I'm just the spokesperson for the project.
All right.
So is this the first seminar in the series in this semester?
No, we've been going since about mid-January. I think you're the first Neo-Keynesian seminar, though, we've had. So
Bob Johnson gave some sticky prices, so we're
That's true. That's true. Yeah, we have it. Okay.
So
good. Yeah. Okay. So let's get started. So we're happy to have Andres here, and Maurizio is in the chat room. So if you have questions you'd like to ask by chat, you can do so. Otherwise, just unmute and break in and ask Andres just like you would in a regular seminar. So Andres, you have an hour. Go ahead and get started.
All right. Thanks a lot for the invitation to present this paper. It's joined with Mauricio here and Jose Pablo Vasquez. I don't know if he's around. And the goal of this paper is to understand the effect of trade shocks on unemployment and overall employment, and look at the way in which once one has those forces in the model, then it matters for what we say about welfare in these cases. So let's start with this, what are going to be our targets in a calibration that I'm going to describe a bit later. So these are results that you're all probably familiar with from the Otto, Dorn, and Hanson China syndrome paper, where they look at the way in which exposure to the China shock, measured in a particular way that I'll also discuss later, affects the unemployment rate and the not in the labor force rate across commuting zones in the US. And so this is for each $1,000 increase in exposure, you have unemployment falling, and this is over the period 2000 to 2007, unemployment increasing by 0.22 points, and the not in the labor force increasing. This is relative to population by 0.55 points. So we're looking at that, and we then we compare it, we think about it in the context of what we normally do in a quantitative trade model. In the standard model, one would have all effects of a shock such as the China shock going through wages and prices. And so real wages would change, but there would be no employment effects. One can easily accommodate changes in employment by adding an upward sloping labor supply curve. And so that would lead to changes in employment. For example, if a country has a negative terms of trade shock, real wage falls and people move down the labor supply curve, and employment falls. The problem with this is that the labor supply would need to be extremely elastic to match the kind of numbers that I showed you in the previous slide, and that there would be no employment effects. And although one could imagine saying, well, I'm going to think about unemployment as just a particular type of not in the labor force, it is, of course, very different. They have very different welfare implications. When you think about decisions that are voluntary, people leaving the labor force voluntarily because they have some alternative, versus involuntary unemployment. And so to have that, we're going to allow for downward nominal wage rigidity. That's kind of the key thing of this paper, and the reason why it has that name is that we're going to bring in this type of nominal rigidity into what otherwise is kind of a standard quantitative trade model, and then calibrate it to the numbers that I showed you in the previous slide and see what the implications are of that. That's the paper in a nutshell. Okay, so the approach is going to be
Andres,
start.
just a quick question. So obviously there's another literature like using international RBC models where, obviously have a standard labor supply decision, and you can think about these things. What's going to be kind of special about doing this in, I'm guessing, like a multi-country model versus just starting with the standard approach that people have worked with for many years?
So the key is that we're going to be able to match to the data at the sector level in a full-blown quantitative trade model, so that we can look at the China shock as it happened and unfolded over this 2000-2007 period. And so, in terms of the qualitative effects, I think you're completely right that there's nothing special in what we're going to do. Although you'll see there are some subtleties there that I think have not been fully appreciated. But I think the main thing is we're going to bring this element, this downward nominal wage rigidity, into a quantitative trade model, and then we're going to, why is that happening? And then we're going to, sorry about that, I don't know why. And then we're going to, okay. Yeah. So it's bringing it to a trade model so that we can do the full quantification with exactile algebra, matching to the sector level data and input-output linkages and trade flows.
Andres, may I ask a question about the the results on the table?
Yeah.
Those are at the metropolitan region. And the left-hand side variable here is unemployment over, you said population over?
Yeah.
What's the denominator?
Population.
Population. So what if people, is all the change in the numerator?
Pretty
saying
much.
the shock happens, the employed people leave.
Yeah.
The unemployed stay. The unemployment rate goes up.
Yeah, there is changes in population. I guess you have in mind the possibility that people migrate.
Yeah.
Across commuting zones. So Otterdorn and Hanson look at that in that paper, and then some subsequent research. They don't find much in terms of people moving across commuting zones. We're going to do it at the state level. And so there's even less of migration to be concerned about.
Now, Andres, the other obvious aspect about that table is a contrast between manufacturing and non-manufacturing. Are you going to come back to it?
Yeah, okay. Come back to it. Okay, so we start with, we build on the Caliendo Pablo model, and we add home production. That's just the simplest, more compatible way of adding an elastic labor supply curve to this kind of model. We're going to have discrete choice with an elastic, that's going to lead discrete choice between home production and work, that is going to lead to this parameter kappa capturing. That's going to be a key parameter determining how elastic is that labor supply. Then we're going to add downward nominal wage rigidity as in the Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe 2016 AER paper, where the wage can fall by no more than a certain percent, 100 times 1 minus delta percent. So delta is going to be the key parameter there. We're going to have exact algebra for counterfactual analysis. This requires data. We're going to do, as I said before, at the state level. So we're going to extend the data set in the WIOD to bring in the 50 US states for the period 2000 and 2007. We're going to calibrate the China shock to match the predicted US imports from China. And we're going to think about the China shock as productivity changes at the sector level in China over this period. And then we're going to pick these two key parameters, the kappa and delta that I mentioned before, to match the two coefficients from ADH in the first slide that I showed you. Once we have that, then we're going to study implications on employment and welfare. So those moments are about the cross-section, are about the relationship between exposure and changes in employment and unemployment. Once we use those moments to calibrate these two parameters, kappa and delta, we can then use the model to simulate the effects of the China shock and look at the GE effects and the way in which employment changes across all the US states, and look at the effects on welfare. Okay, as a preview of findings, this nominal rigidity is going to have important effects in the way that states are adjusting to the China shock. If we start with no downward nominal wage rigidity, then 3 states lose and suffer declines in employment. Basically, these are the states that have negative terms of trade shocks from the China shock. Okay, so they're going to experience declines in the real wage, and then workers are going to move down their labor supply curve. Once you add the nominal rigidity, there's going to be 13 states that lose in terms of welfare, and then 41 states are going to suffer declines in employment and going to experience unemployment in a transition. So here you see the difference between kind of the standard shock, which is all about terms of trade shock, and the shocks that matter once we have nominal rigidities, which are going to imply that even states that experience positive terms of trade shocks can lose and can suffer declines in employment. The aggregate level, there's going to be a 0.8 percentage point increase in unemployment. Again, this is overpopulation, and a 1.1 point decline in labor force participation. The year in which the effects are magnified is 2004, and then they kind of drop towards the end of the period. And then in terms of welfare, for the average US state, the welfare gain is going to be between 1/3 and 2/3 of the welfare gain that we would get if we ignored downward nominal wage rigidities.
Andres.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about the deficit in the exchange rate adjustments to, say, goods in China getting cheaper?
In the baseline, we're going to take the trade imbalance that existed at the beginning of the period, and we're going to keep that fixed. In an extension, we're going to consider 2 possibilities, but let's say the simplest one is we take the actual increase in the trade surplus in China over Chinese GDP. we're going to assume that all of that increase is absorbed by a US trade deficit. And we're going to run the simulation with that.
Okay.
And the results actually don't change that much when we do that. They become a little bit better actually for the US.
So, and then are you going to, as an outside check, look at the trade volumes as that you get out at the sectoral level of the US exports and imports?
We're calibrating to those. Let me come back to that when we get there.
Andres, one more. So monetary policy can undo it, right? So do you think US is at zero lower bound? That's why they're not using monetary policy to undo it? That's the assumption? That's
the assumption. I'll go. This is big. This is a big part of the story. So I'm going to have slides.
More generally, there is a trade-off there. And of course, the question is how much weight you put on different states. Do you willing to help some states by inflating on average?
Yeah.
So this could be questions actually why monetary policy doesn't address it more, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we think that one hand-wavy way of thinking about this is to say there are some losses from inflation that are not in our model, and so what in our model would look like a crazy, in our model is going to be extremely simple on this side, and so you would say, well, just increase liquidity, increase the nominal GDP, and then the wage doesn't need to fall, and downward nominal wage rigidity would not be binding, and then that's in our model. For interpretation, you would need to say, well, there is something else that either there was and we've had discussions about this, either there's a monetary policy mistake, or there is some other cost that the monetary authority is considering that leads them not to want to increase liquidity.
Just to chime in.
And just to, the issue is not only across US states, even if, I'll talk more about this, but even if the US was a single region, the problem would arise. So it's not only about some states relative to others.
But Andres, if they had a policy of fixing the nominal wage, if monetary policy just rigidly targeted the nominal wage, then you don't have a problem at all. And there's no inflation or anything. So it really, it seems like a pretty serious failure of monetary policy if the problem is that nominal wage.
I'm not sure I agree with what you said, but it's going to be extremely clear in 2 slides and we can come back to it.
Okay.
Can I ask just a quick aside?
Maybe I just missed it, but we're going to have in front of us the right things to discuss it more in a bit. Just
a quick aside. Andres, those were assumptions under perfect foresight. It was all a surprise. Just to anchor me.
The model has no frictions. There's no costs of moving across sectors. And so workers don't need to form expectations about the future. So
I don't understand that. Obviously, trade policy was changing. What did people know about that and when?
They know everything. It's fine. Workers are going to make the best decisions every year, and then they can reverse them next year without any cost.
Doesn't that determine like any wage setting or anything like that?
I'm not sure I follow that. Give me.
Okay, we'll see.
4 slides. Four slides for that.
Okay.
Okay. So literature. What do I want to say here? There's of course another way of adding unemployment, which is via search and matching. We think that this is actually this is not going to lead to the kind of results we get. So what this is going to do is amplify terms of trade effects. So if the terms of trade effect is negative, then you're going to get unemployment and people dropping out of the labor force. But what we seem to, what we're going to get and what is needed to match the evidence combined with a model like, trade model, is that even countries that had positive terms of trade shocks experienced unemployment. And that's what the nominal wage rigidity is going to allow. In some models, like our interpretation of the Adao Arcolakis Esposito paper, is you allow the labor supply decision to depend on the nominal wage and not on the real wage. So some type of money illusion could also deliver a result like the one that we're going to get. And the final thing I'm going to say is there's a paper by Jonathan and Sam and Neiman that gets into similar issues where they have quantitative trade model and they add relative wage rigidity. So relative wages across countries don't adjust, and then the adjustments are happening in terms of employment. So what we're doing is we're kind of providing, thinking about downward nominal wage rigidity as a way in which that happens, and then taking it, using the resulting model to think about the China shock and how it matches the ADH findings. Okay, so let me just move on. So these are, there's going to be a couple of slides here which are just providing intuition for the way in which things are going to happen in the model. These are very simple, but I think it's better to just make sure that we have this clear before we get into all the details of the actual model. So think about two regions, two countries, so China and the US. Forget about US states, it's just the US as a whole. And the starred variables are for foreign, and the other ones are for home. Let's say the US is home. And what we're going to think about, so this is the relative wage of home to foreign. And this is the foreign technology level, A star. And so given that A star and given the relative wage, that's going to deliver a ratio of the labor demand in value, so WL over W star L star, coming simply from kind of the demand for goods in the two countries. Okay, so that's this this curve. And what we have here is the foreign wage and the home employment. We're going to think about shocks that are going to increase demand, so they're going to decrease relative demand in home to foreign. And so the type of issue they're going to they would require is a decline in the US wage, the home wage. If you were thinking of labor supply as perfectly elastic, then the adjustment would be W would fall or W star would increase, so that there's full employment in both, and L and L star would not change, right? That's the standard way in which we would think about it. But since we're going to have downward nominal wage rigidity, we're going to fix the W, the home wage, at the level it was, and the variable that can adjust is W star, and in home the variable that can adjust is L, is employment, right? That's the adjustment variables. And here's where so we're going to, so that's with downward nominal wage rigidity. W is not going to be able to fall, and we're going to add this nominal anchor to the system. So this is saying there's a constant worldwide nominal GDP, right? So this is GDP in home and this is GDP in foreign. The wage here is at its lower bound, and there's not going to be unemployment in foreign. So that's just L bar star. Okay? So when the technology shock comes, the foreign A increases, that's going to imply that to maintain full employment in the US, you would need the foreign wage to increase until we get to that level, right? At that point, L would remain in home, L would remain at L bar, and there would be no unemployment in the US. The problem is this requires the foreign wage to increase a lot, and so it would violate, right? You see that it's outside the red line, so it would violate the nominal world GDP rule. And so you cannot have that. Of course, the other thing that could happen is you go all the way here with the foreign wage not changing at all. And so there's simply this A star increase that lowers demand in home, and there would be a big increase in unemployment. With the nominal wage, the nominal anchor that we're adopting, what's going to happen is something in the middle. You go along this curve and reach this point. And that leads to this equilibrium employment, and the difference is going to be the unemployment in home. That's the bare bones mechanics of this. So the W is not changing, W star is increasing, but it cannot increase too much because of the nominal GDP rule, and so you end up with unemployment in home.
So this model would say that US policy should be the opposite toward China than what it is, that we should be telling the Chinese that they should be sending the renminbi to be worthless. So the US can grab up all, we're thinking of G in dollars.
Yes.
And that way the US could have a big employment boom.
Yeah, what the US would want is the Chinese wage in dollars to increase, right? So that would be if the wage.
I thought you said W
local currency. No, W star you would want that.
Oh, I see. Right. W star is the Chinese wage in dollars. Okay. So we do want them to. G is fixed. By W star going up, we make L go down.
Yes, so this allows this, and this is this curve. This is this line here.
Yeah, but I'm seeing if W star goes down, L will go up.
Oh, but the forces are not pushing in that direction, right? What you want is the relative wage in home to fall.
That's along the blue line. Along the red line, don't I want the opposite?
And the red line is just the constraint. But the way I would think about this is, I think about what would normally happen, what I need to see happening for the relative wage, if I fix the employment levels at the full employment, right? Mm-hmm. So L star and L are not changing, and then as you increase the productivity, you would need this to fall. How does that fall? You need W to fall or W star to increase. That's the force. That's what you want. And you would want that to happen without fully, so that you don't get any changes in L. But the problem is with W capped from falling by W under bar, then what you need is W star to increase, and that would be this movement. Yeah. And yet you cannot have that, because then you would have nominal GDP increasing. And so the only way you can get it is by having some of the burden in W star, but then you also need L to fall. So you get W star increasing, L falling, along this line, and you end
Andreas,
up with unemployment.
what I'm confused about, because I'm kind of thinking about it maybe like Jonathan from the paper we did with Brent, and we would have said the vertical thing, red line, was exactly what should have happened, but wasn't happening because we were talking about, say, within Europe, where you're all using the euro, so you couldn't have this exchange rate change. But I don't really see why the exchange rate change violates some condition, because seems like your vertical line is just the value of the Chinese currency going up, which seems very natural. It kind of fits in with lots of people squawking about China fixing the exchange rate. So I'm not quite sure why.
It's this nominal.
You're kind of ruling it out, but I don't really see what that G equation is.
So the G equation is the nominal anchor, and it's saying there is something that prevents world nominal GDP from increasing. It is so I guess a more natural or more common approach to this would be to say the US nominal GDP is fixed, or that's the US nominal GDP is the nominal anchor. That would then lead to the kind of things that Oleg was implying, and that the only thing this would lead to is that the US is not necessarily optimally adjusting so that all states don't have the wage hitting the downward nominal bound. But it would then the downward nominal wage rigidity in the US would have no bite if the foreign wages can increase.
And maybe
right.
This
it would allow the relative wage between the US and China, home and foreign here, to adjust fully with no effect on unemployment. So this is critical, right? There is something, this is an important assumption in our model, and it's going to do a lot of the work. And I guess the discussion is, how do we interpret that in the real world?
There are several things that we could say here. First is that this is like too simplified in our model. You can think that either the red line is going to shift outward every period, or that the wage is going to be able to decrease a little bit more every period. So we're not going to end up with this equilibrium. There's going to be some temporary unemployment, and then it's going to go away as the wage can fall or the nominal anchor moves outward. The second thing is that the nominal anchor is a reduced form thing. Of course, like we have been discussing, is not too realistic, but it can capture something like China not wanting too much inflation and also not wanting to allow too much depreciation because they want to remain competitive. And so this is capturing that like in a reduced form way, or is capturing something like a global zero lower bound. And like the macro side is definitely going to be simplified because we're assuming this thing that, of course, is not ideal. But then the trade part is going to be rich as in trade models. And that's kind of what we're buying. We don't have to log linearize. We're going to be able to do exact algebra while imposing this downward nominal wage rigidity. So that's the trade-off.
I guess the key thing here is, there's kind of two things. First, to make sure that the mechanism is clear, right? So you need the downward nominal wage rigidity combined with the world nominal GDP rule. That's the way in which things are going to, the China shock is going to lead to unemployment in the US. And then there's the discussion of how good is this assumption? Does this assumption make sense? And as Mauricio said, we think it captures something close to a world insufficient nominal demand because of a zero lower bound, or because China's policy that is not sufficiently accommodated by the US policy. But our paper is going to be, we're going to take that and we're going to see the effects it has.
Can I quickly chip in? So I guess what Charles said.
This is just a quick thing to say. there is this the Dombo Fisher Samuelson paper, this 77. There is this part towards the end where they have kind of an old-fashioned version of what we're doing, which is saying there's a fixed amount of money in home and foreign, a fixed velocity of money, and that leads to the same type of line, of that red line that we had in the previous slide.
Andres, could I quickly chip in? So I think what Charles said in the beginning is there is a major failure of the monetary policy if it does not want to track nominal wages. And so I agree with that. But I think the good case in the trade context, in the geographical context, what you can make is that there are locations where nominal wage is going up as a result of trade. And there are locations where nominal wage is going down. And so what monetary policy does is on average trying to get, stability of prices and wages. But that could be particularly bad for certain states and locations and geographies where wages actually have to fall. And I think the big quantitative question is, can we generate in this model that in certain location nominal wages have to fall by a lot, basically, right? And then
can I just throw something in? I'm kind of lost here because there should be prices as well, goods prices, and nominal wage. I mean, so far I'm totally lost because nominal wage rigidity doesn't seem like it would mean much if goods prices were going up. You need the real wage to go down in the U.S. relative to China, right? And that could be because prices go up in the U.S. relative to China, nominal prices. So it's kind of a little bit.
So price equals exactly what price mean. Equals to marginal cost.
But marginal cost and
marginal cost is equal to the wage over productivity. And that's what we're using. So prices are moving. Of course, prices are moving. The reason why demand is depending on the wage is because the wage affects prices. Prices affect how consumers allocate their expenditure across different countries.
So this is somehow, okay, I mean, this is unusual. Right, if it's in terms of trade that are adjusting, they're free to adjust here.
The only thing that is unusual here is this curve, but this other part, that's just standard. So let me go to.
I mean, what I don't see right away, Andres, is if you quadruple the money supply, it seems like P could go up, even if W were fixed. And there's somehow something you're telling me about price setting that's not letting that happen, and I don't quite get.
No. Wait. Sorry. How would the price increase if the wage is not increasing? If the price is equal to marginal cost?
Well, that's what it depends on the model you're writing down.
Well, I'm going to get to the model in now, but this is not nothing special, right? This is just perfectly competitive markets.
Andres, can I ask a very quick question, picking up on Charles' point? If the price is wage over productivity, then the price is not moving relative to the local production is not moving relative to wages. The Chinese is going down. So the only reason why people are going to be worse off is because they import goods from other states whose wages are going up. Is that it?
People may be worse off because of the unemployment that is created by the downward nominal wage rigidity. If without that, they would be better off because, typical model like this, the foreign productivity goes up and then their relative wage goes down, but the real wage goes up. And that's disturbed here simply because of the effects on unemployment.
I guess what is throwing me a little bit is that typically in a New-Keynesian model, somebody has the ability to set a nominal price or a nominal wage because the market isn't competitive. And that's not true in the Schmidt-Grohe-Uribe, where this thing just comes out of nowhere. But I think that does make a big difference. And I think that's what's throwing me off here. But I'll just leave it at that. But to say, to have a downward nominal wage rigidity, who's setting that? Why can't they go down? It seems like something's not competitive there.
It's fully competitive, but there's this ad hoc rule. Let me get to that now. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit fast on some of the details because they are standard in a quantitative trade model. So there are a bunch of regions, some inside the US, some outside. There's a bunch of sectors, and then there's these broad sectors. So think about a bunch of manufacturing sectors that belong to manufacturing. Manufacturing is a broad sector, that's one example. And then there's agriculture and services, and they are also another broad sector. That would be one example. But just more generally, sectors can belong to broad sectors. The reason we introduce the broad sectors is that we're going to allow for mobility frictions across broad sectors. So workers are there's a perfectly elastic labor supply curve across manufacturing subsectors, for example. So across sectors within a broad sector. And then there may be these frictions that affect the way in which people are willing to move from one broad sector to another. If you, in the baseline, we're going to have the broad sector is going to be the whole economy. And so there's not going to be mobility frictions at all in the baseline, but then we bring in those frictions in an extension. And so this just allows for that. There's no mobility across regions, as I said before. Production uses labor and intermediate inputs. Preferences and technology are as follows. There's Cobb-Douglas preferences across sectors in consumption. And then there is Cobb-Douglas technology in the use of sectors as inputs and labor. So that leads to this part. This is just productivity. These are trade costs. And then think about this as just Armington, an Armington trade model with the sigma K being the elasticity of substitution in sector K across the varieties produced from different countries. So we're going to have exogenous trade imbalances so that the value of consumption at a period is equal to nominal GDP in that country, which is just the wage bill, plus some transfers that country I receives from the rest of the world at time t. And then everything else is pretty standard. Lambdas are just the trade shares from CES, Armington. And then here you're just adding up demand in a sector from as inputs and as final goods. That's equal to R, the total revenues in a sector. And then you multiply that by the labor share, add up across broad sectors, and that gives you labor demand in value across broad sectors that has to be equal to the wage bill. And then in the standard model, you would just close this by saying labor demand in the whole economy has to be equal to labor supply. And that would be it. So here we're going to add home production. So there's going to be random preference draws for home and work, as well as for work among different broad sectors.
Sorry, Andres?
Yeah.
So these guys aren't making any dynamic decisions at all?
No.
That's what you said before. So
correct.
So it's really the only decisions they're kind of told how much to consume, and all they're doing is making decisions on how to allocate things to sort of do that amount of consumption. That's it.
Correct.
And okay. And they're not making any moving decisions or anything like that.
They are.
I didn't see. Are you going to do the problem with the consumer in a second, I guess, or?
No, the problem of the consumer is these are Cobb-Douglas preferences, so this is just that. The problem of now the household, let's say, the agent is going to decide to consume and decide to work. In the decision to work is going to be as follows. So you get this discrete choice problem where you're getting this preference draws across broad sectors and between across broad sectors and for home production, right? And from there you decide where you want to work. and then you allocate all your labor to that sector that gives you the highest income. And that's going to lead to this result that the supply to broad sector B in country I at T is equal to the total number of people in that country at time T times the number of them that decide to work rather than stay home and do home production, times the share of those people that work that supply labor to broad sector B. And then these pies are these ones, right? So you get, think about this for now as just the real wage. So this is the real wage in, this is the kind of an index of the real wage for country I times T elevated to that power kappa. And then the same thing, and this is the, say, income stream or actually kind of utility stream coming out of home production. And then that index I mentioned is given here by kind of CES aggregating of the wages in the broad sectors. And then this is the share of people that if they decide to work, what percentage of them are going to offer labor to broad sector B. Right, so this is all pretty standard discrete choice with this kind of
Andres, there's some value function in the background here, right? Where I need to know like
yeah.
how everything's evolving in the future, and
there are no dynamic decisions.
No, but you
so
said
you
you're
don't
moving
need to
people.
know.
You're moving. I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, they're making static decisions. There's no they just decide today. What's happening today? Oh, today I work in manufacturing or something.
So the discount factor is equal to,
who cares? Tomorrow
that's fine.
I
so the discount factor,
make my decision again.
That's fine. So these guys have their discount factor is 0. Let's just call it that.
No.
Then why aren't they?
Factor
If,
is
if I'm in,
it is.
if
textiles
is
I just make my decision tomorrow again. Nothing that I do today affects how I'm going to the decisions I can make tomorrow.
Sorry, so the sector that I'm in doesn't have like a different draw or anything like that.
Yeah, this is all happening today, and then tomorrow you get, and even if it wasn't, even if you get the same draws.
No, I'm just trying to understand. Like, we made decisions to be professors, and it's easier for us to continue being professors than do pretty much anything else. And so that knowing like how the market for professors is going to evolve is going to affect my decision to stay being a professor and not being a professor.
No, because
in the real world, yes, but in your model, no.
Yeah, in my model, no.
Okay.
Because whatever I do today, I can undo tomorrow at 0 cost.
Okay.
And just very quickly, we are adding like CDP features so that exactly what George is saying will now happen in the model. So that now we have to be forward looking and think about the passive utility. And we're almost done with that extension, but we didn't have the results ready. So that's why we're presenting the old version now. But that new version is promising.
No, that's great. I just wanted to make sure because I haven't seen a max anywhere. So I was just kind of unsure. So
the maxes are, I mean, underlying this piece.
No, I got you. I just wasn't clear. So sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I got it now.
Okay. So with no wage rigidities, these omegas would just be the real wages. With rigidities, we may have an employment. And so we have to think about what's the real wage that a worker sees or takes into account as that worker decides what to do in terms of work. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say you take that real wage in broad sector B and you multiply it by the probability of getting a job in sector B. And so that's the employment in sector B over labor supply in sector B. That's the probability of employment. And so implicitly what we're saying here is that there is insurance among all the people that go into sector B. Some are going to get a job and some don't, but then you spread the income equally across everybody. Or they're risk neutral in some sense. But we're not taking into account that risk, which, you know, so this is an extreme assumption to simplify things, but we're not taking that that risk into account in affecting decisions of people about what they will do.
And while this is a simplification, the nice thing that it delivers us is that in this case, if there's going to be unemployment in one sector, then people won't not want to go into that sector. So we will need a smaller labor supply elasticity to get the effects in ADH.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So do they understand like one place might be a higher, that's what I'm trying to understand. Do they understand that one place might have a higher unemployment rate?
Yes.
Than another when they're
Yes.
making that choice with the Gumbel things? Yes.
Yes.
I see. Okay, that is in there.
They take they take into account that the probability of actually getting a job is lower, and they look at the expected income associated with that decision. All right. Okay, so downward nominal wage rigidity, we're going to bring it in like in Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe, as I said before. So the wage at time t in broad sector B in local currency units has to be higher than or equal to some delta of the wage in that sector last period. Okay, so if delta is 0.99, it means that the wage can fall by 1% at most every year. And then what you have is the employment cannot be higher than supply, and you get this complementary slackness equation to capture either you have full employment and the wage is above the lower bound, or the wage is at the lower bound, and then you can have unemployment. For regions outside of the US, there's an exchange rate with respect to dollars. And so what we would, so the previous equation becomes this one. And in the baseline, we're going to assume that all countries except the US have full exchange rate flexibility so that they're going to be able to avoid unemployment simply by depreciating against the dollar. And what that is going to imply is that kind of all the burden of adjustment associated with the fixed nominal GDP rule in the world and productivity increases in China are going to be absorbed by the US. But we then also do an extension where we have fixed exchange rate in other countries so that they kind of share in the burden of adjustment and also have some unemployment, and that doesn't change things that much. So in the baseline, we're just going to have the US having unemployment, and all the other countries are going to have full employment. Now, the thing is the US cannot depreciate against the world nominal GDP, which is in dollars, right? So that's what I was showing you before with the G. So this is world nominal GDP at time t, and this is world nominal GDP at time t-1, and we're saying world nominal GDP grows at some exogenous constant rate gamma. We're going to set that gamma to 1, and so this is again as in Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe. So all the action is going to be in delta, right? The key is the gap or the difference, the kind of this balance between delta and gamma, right? You can have a lot of nominal rigidity, but if gamma is high, so that there's inflation, downward nominal wage rigidity would have no effect, right? So what we're saying is there is no inflation at all. Gamma is 1, and so if delta is 0.99, that means the wage can fall by 1%, and yeah, the inflation is not going to save you from the implications of that rigidity. Okay, I'm not going to go through this, obviously. This is just to say, kind of use it as a way, as a device to say how we're going to solve this. Basically, we match the data in 2000. That's the initial year, and then we just roll forward, right? That's the benefit of people not having to make, not having to have these expectations about the future, because all decisions are kind of reversible. And as Mauricio said, we are now extending this to incorporate costs of moving that force people to form expectations about the future and kind of anticipate things, as in Caliendo, Borkin, and Paru. But that's not what we have so far. So basically, I need to move, I need to run, but there's going to be variables that are endogenous for which we're solving every year. There's going to be the shocks. These are like the productivity shocks in China. There's things that are predetermined that come from either the data in 2000 or the solution of the model, let's say in 2005. Then we have data that we use to pin down some parameters, and then finally some parameters that we calibrate. So we think that, you know, as we were discussing before, we're capturing things on the macro side in a very stylized way. But part of the benefit is that we can then use the machinery of quantitative trade models that we think allow for lots of transparency in how data affects the results. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. This is just how we're putting together the data so that we get kind of extension of WIOD to the 50 US states. This is the computation of the exposure to China that we're going to use to relate to ADH and to show our results. But this is kind of standard, so I'm going to skip this. This is the calibration of the technology changes in China, calibration of the China shock. Basically, what we're doing is we want to replicate what happened to US imports at the sector level from China. But we're projecting kind of ADH style. We're projecting that on the increases in imports by third countries from China, so that what we're capturing are the supply shocks in China. And then we're going to calibrate things so that not only are we getting productivity shocks at the sector level in China, which is this, but we're also tracking the way in which this happened over time. So what we're going to see is that the shock seems to be most stronger in 2002, 2003, 2004, and we're going to replicate that in the way that we're going to calibrate things. We set the trade elasticity to 5. As I said, we set gamma equal to 1. The baseline has a single broad sector. And so now we just calibrate the model so that, in particular, we calibrate delta and kappa. This is downward nominal wage rigidity, and this is the labor supply curve, so that we match that 0.22 and 0.55 that I showed you in the first slide. That's the way in which unemployment and labor force participation adjust to exposure to the China shock. What we get is delta of 0.984, which means that wages can fall by 1.6% per year. That's actually very close to what Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe get in their paper. And then the kappa that we get is 5.9, which with a 2/3 labor force participation over population implies a labor supply elasticity of around 2, which is kind of on the high side relative to micro estimates, but in the ballpark of recent estimates in macro. Okay, so I have 1 minute and I haven't shown results. So at least let me show you this. So this is the way in which the average employment across US states evolves during the period of the China shock. And what we see is that the model starts here there's actually a bit of an increase in employment, and then it drops in the years where the China shock is hitting the most. It recovers as the wages can fall, and then you get another little shock here, and then finally it recovers. And notice that this is higher than it's higher than zero, which means that in the end the employment is higher than what it was at the beginning. So this is all caused, on average, is all caused by the fact that these wages cannot fall fully, and so unemployment arises. As unemployment arises, people then kind of get discouraged from looking for work, and more of them stay home until the adjustment takes place, wages fall, and then the economy goes back to full employment and a higher labor force participation because the real wage is higher. I guess I have to stop there. Right? Do I have to stop?
You can take a couple minutes if you want. We didn't start until 3:02, so go ahead.
Andres,
okay,
can I just ask one quick question? So,
but George is going to come and steal one of your 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But okay,
no,
go ahead.
The Great Recession would have been a lot worse, huh?
Yeah.
What is it about 2008? Like, I mean, the Great Recession would have been, terrible if we hadn't have had the China shock. So what was it in 2007 to 2008 in your model that sort of gets the integration with China, like really boosting employment a ton?
Oh, this is simply because the China shock kind of, well, in our simulation calibration, we're matching the ADH period, which is 2000-2007, and then the China we have the China shock stops in 2007. So there's no more shocks after that. And then
I got it. So it's
just no more shock, and then the wage now fully adjusting to whatever happened before.
But you could have just traced out the model even further, and
sure.
So we shouldn't really look at 2007 beyond 2007. I got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So then just let me just do this one, and then this is a good slide to finish. There's a lot more in the paper, so look at the paper. But let me do this one. So here's what happens to period utility. So period utility takes a hit here. So this is what would have happened if there was no downward nominal wage rigidity. So this is actually the kind of the standard model. This is what happens in the standard model if you add an elastic labor supply curve. You get bigger increase in utility because people can adjust, and so they can benefit from the increase in the real wage by supplying more labor. But when you add downward nominal wage rigidity, then you get unemployment hitting, and that leads to lower utility, which kind of recovers, takes a little hit, and then recovers fully to the end. So then what we do for welfare, and the numbers I was saying before, is you want to just add all this up to the present value at time 2000 with some discount rate. And that's what we do here. So like with our central number is with a beta of 0.95, the increase in welfare would have been 0.32%, and in the calibrated model, it would be around 0.22%. So that's the sense in which we say in the baseline analysis, there will be a decline in the welfare gains from the China shock of around 1/3. Okay, now let me leave it there.
Okay, so we'll just leave the stream open. If you have a question, just go ahead and jump in, or you can raise your hand either way.
I have a question. So I wasn't at the Fed in the early 2000s, but I know that George was, and if he's still around, maybe he can chime in on this. What was the Fed doing that is captured by this nominal world GDP constraint?
it's just worrying about domestic issues, and it wasn't seeing much unemployment because remember, the unemployment that we generate at the aggregate level on the US is only 0.8. We're not saying there was unemployment of 3 or 4% so that the Fed was freaking out and having to change monetary policy. It was something small that happened gradually, and then the Fed was concerned for other things, maybe the bubble that was going on in the housing market or something else, and did not react immediately. Over time, the wages adjusted, and also the Fed could have reacted, and then this thing goes away.
I had a thought on that, which may not sound serious, but it is. I see your the Great Recession in your model as the G collapsing. We had Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns in financial sector collapse, which reduced G. It'd be kind of fun in this model just to track what was happening to world nominal GDP and see what happens to your red line as a consequence, pushing the model in the future a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, the Fed's trying to make G go back up again.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. I would say, the benefit of our model is the richness in capturing the trade data at the sector level and tracing out what happened with the China shock across US states. And that, if I try to take that model to do something more macro like that, I probably wouldn't get too far.
How do you know?
Well, in the sense that there are more, for that, I think there are more sophisticated models that kind of do the same thing, but with more of the bells and whistles that one would then want to make sure to have in a macro model to look at.
And also the welfare effects that we would have then would be a combination of the China shock plus the Great Recession.
No, I'm just saying do a different experiment, which is just track what happened, start in 2008, track what happened to world nominal GDP. That's your G.
Yeah, that's something we can do for sure.
But yeah, okay. But that's just a matter of looking at what happened to nominal GDP in the world after 2008.
And just see what would happen to employment in different countries under different assumptions about.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Under different assumptions about wage rigidity and looking at what happened to exchange rates.
Yeah. I see. No, now I understand.
Because I think there was a big drop in nominal world GDP, dollar GDP with the recession.
Yeah, that's something we can try for sure.
Right. There was a decline in employment and there was no inflation. So there must have been a decline in world nominal GDP. Yeah, I think that's interesting actually. Yeah, I didn't get it at the beginning, but it makes sense.
It would be helpful if you kind of went about things the other way and cooked up a monetary policy where the nominal wage rigidity didn't matter. That was kind of the point of the Schmidt-Grohe-Uribe paper was, fixed exchange rates are really awful if you've got downward nominal wage rigidity. And here, it's kind of confusing to figure out what your monetary policy is doing. So it would, it seems like you could cook up one where the effect would be, maybe even disappear, and you would only have the kind of the real distortions playing a role. And then, think about, well, why don't we have that monetary policy? And that would be helpful for me. And although Oleg is gone, I think he was struggling with the same thing as, how much of this is because of a bad monetary policy, which was exactly what Schmidt-Grohe and Uribe were complaining about.
So I understood. First, you're thinking, what is a a model of monetary policy that is kind of more standard that would lead to the same implications as the G constraint that we're considering? Is that fair?
No. I mean the opposite. The problem here is you've got a nominal rigidity, and you could undo the effects of any nominal rigidity with the right monetary policies with the U.S. and China. If you could say you could completely undo it, and then you would only have the real rigidities that the standard model has left. And I guess what I'm saying is, it would be helpful for me, for purposes of comparison, to write down what that monetary policy would be. And then we could think about, well, how unrealistic is that policy? So in the Schmidt-Grohe and Uribe paper, you just needed flexible exchange rates, and monetary policy was doing something. I can't remember what, but
I think that is part of what we're getting at. And actually, we have solved the model that way, because if we have the delta equal to 0, there's no downward nominal wage rigidity, and only the real frictions are playing a part. And in that case, no unemployment is generated, and we need an extremely large labor supply elasticity in order to match just the employment effects that ADH find, and we can, of course, not match the unemployment effects.
Sorry, what was delta?
The downward nominal wage rigidity. Say if it's 0.98.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is, let's just say that's part of the model, that wages can't adjust downward, but then there's something else you could do with monetary policy. That
say gamma, pick gamma.
We can find the gamma.
Gamma T. Charles wants to say pick gamma T to implement the flex price allocation.
Yep. Yeah.
And then look at what gamma T looks like.
Right.
And then is it super sensitive? Like if you just move the Fed like 1 basis point, the flex price allocations implemented?
It's not super sensitive. Like in order to get the flex price equilibrium, we need something like 2% inflation per year, which is kind of the target. So that would be saying that the Fed couldn't do it just with like 2%, but that's without taking into account that like maybe China was trying to prevent a depreciation. That's something that would not be captured just by what the Fed was doing.
Yeah. No, I think you would need to, right. But that's what I would find interesting, because I think you would need both China and the US. But the question is, would they have to be doing something that's just super far from what we ever think they would do, or, are not?
No, yeah, they wouldn't have to be doing something crazy. But that's what I'm emphasizing again, that the unemployment that's generated here is not a bunch. So if we were generating a big amount of unemployment, and we were saying they would have to do something really small to get rid of that huge amount of unemployment, yeah, don't believe that. But here, the unemployment at the aggregate level in the US is pretty small. So the fact that they had to do something with small change, they would have been able to get rid of it is not so problematic. Yeah. In some states of the US, it's big, right? Or let's say in manufacturing in certain states. But in the US on aggregate, it's pretty small. So that's what I was saying, that we don't need to justify a huge monetary policy mistake, because the aggregate effects on the US are not huge.
Well, but I don't want to harp on this, but it's something it seems like there's something they could do that would, it's not just the aggregate, but everything would be the same as if wages were flexible. And, that would help me understand a little bit.
Conditional on the China.
I didn't understand that.
Let me get that. I think conditional on the China response, it's true. They would be able to do something. But now, if China was dead set on not having both domestic inflation and a big depreciation because they wanted to preserve competitiveness, then as the US respond more, they also respond more. And then you have to play a game, like a game theory problem between the Chinese Monetary Authority and the Fed. And that's what we're trying to capture with that.
So the question is sort of what could they do, but also what you just said was a little weird, because somehow you're saying that China could like set real wages with monetary policy, which isn't, they could set the exchange rate and prices, which I don't think they can quite do, but maybe they can. But anyway, I'm just saying, suppose China wasn't doing that. I'm just wondering what what monetary policies would get around that nominal wage rigidity. That's all I'm asking.
Okay, no, yeah, that we
yeah.
already know. It's just inflating a little bit more, and then that would get rid of everything, conditional on the Chinese response.
Okay.
And then we wouldn't observe unemployment, which we did with ADH found, and you could say it's coming from other reasons, like a search and matching framework, but that's not able to deliver the results that we see in ADH either. But yeah, Andres, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, broadly speaking, and I'm not sure that Mauricio agrees, but my way of thinking about this is either there was some kind of zero lower bound problem that the Fed wasn't able to increase liquidity, and so escape the downward nominal wage rigidity that way, or the implications of that would have been inflation or something else that they wanted to avoid, or they made a mistake, and or that's what Mauricio was saying. There was just this lack of coordination with China, and the concern that China would respond, and that would lead to something else, right? You have to there's something in those are the different possibilities, and certainly in this paper we're not getting there. I think it's a very interesting question, because the implications are important. I mean, it's true that the increase in unemployment is not that high, but it's sufficiently high, and if all it took was a small expansion in monetary policy to undo it, you would think why would it would make sense to do it. So understanding which of this is it cost of inflation, is it a mistake, is it the threat of China retaliating in some way, or adjusting? I think that's an interesting question.
So I want to say, first, like, monetary policy was really loose in the mid 2000s. I mean, it wasn't very tight during that time period, just to keep that in mind. So one thing I want to echo some of
that could imply that it couldn't be looser, right?
Yeah. That's what I mean, it could have been a little bit looser, but it was pretty. So, but one thing I want to say about, so Charles was asking about, if you actually had these guys setting wages. So there's firms, they're setting the wages, they're forward looking. So I would definitely think about that in terms of, like, if you didn't have such a mechanical downward nominal rigidity, would that undo things? But then there's a second issue, there's a spatial issue. So, like, you might think that like, I was in my head is, if the places with a comparative disadvantage, so they're the ones that are going to be hit by China, are actually not the sticky price places, that would undo this thing as well. So it's like, by just having everyone facing the same rigidity, it's kind of too harsh. So I mean, so I don't know how you say your name. I'm not going to say it, but he was in the chat, Mauricio. I mean, I can barely speak English. So the thing is that it's like, so you talked about social norms. When I look at the ADH stuff, the first thing that comes to my mind is like the unions. So you look at that, like that table that you showed, like inside manufacturing, outside manufacturing, it looks like this is some union, or maybe it's a right to work issue in these. So it's like, that's kind of like, so I think that might be worth kind of thinking a little bit more about the spatial dimension in which that price stickiness bites or doesn't bite.
I think that's super interesting, and not only like spatial, but also like the sectors, as you were saying, like broad sectors like manufacturing versus services. And precisely what you were saying, if the China shock was hitting the most sectors that are the most like wage flex wages, then it wouldn't do the effects. But what we're finding is the opposite, because when we do an extension of the model in which there's only downward nominal wage rigidity in manufacturing, that gets even closer to the ADH effects, which means that it seems, or we can match not only like the two targets that we have, but like the changes in manufacturing wages, manufacturing employment, non-manufacturing wages, non-manufacturing employment. So it seems like the China shock is hitting the sectors that have the least flexible wages, perhaps because of unions or because manufacturing was in decline anyway. So it was kind of closer to that downward nominal wage rigidity. So we agree with that, and we think that's important. Which sectors are being hit and how much rigidity they display.
I see. Did you target those, like the rankings on that stuff, or that just come out?
We only target unemployment and not in the labor force. The other thing came out.
Interesting.
Yeah, the only thing what we do here is we target again the delta, but the delta only applies to manufacturing. And then we target the, I mean, we calibrate the kappa too. And then we get things where we get the employment and wage effects in manufacturing and non-manufacturing to align quite closely to the ADH results.
Yeah, you get the big non-manufacturing wage and then the zero on the manufacturing wage. Because that was going to be my next question, is like, what's going on when you run the wage regressions with the sticky price stuff? Is that undoing that stuff? And this actually looks like it's doing a good job. So
yeah.
I mean, the only other thing I'd say is I'm going to be more polite than George, and he's not here. So the thing is, I think one question is about intertemporal motives in labor supply. And, that's kind of all completely shut off here. And I mean, another maybe less polite way to think about it is maybe your model labor supply is just not right. And, you're trying to fix a not right model. You know what I mean? And so, I mean, I get that, like, this is convenient for, plug it into the quantitative trade models, but I don't feel like that has to constrain us all the time.
Sure.
What do you think would be different, Mike?
My paper with Spencer Lyon. There we have, there's intertemporal forward-looking motives. They accumulate assets. And what the assets do is it changes your willingness to supply labor in different states of nature. And it's generating variable labor supply elasticities.
And do you think that's going to change? How is that going to change the results here?
Well, I'm saying that I'm saying in my model, I can generate plausible labor supply responses. Whereas, like Andreas was saying, that in their model, without the downward nominal rigidity, they don't get plausible labor supply responses. And so I'm just saying, like, if you have a more complicated model, you don't need to resort to the nominal wage rigidity. Now, I don't think I can get now I'm going to admit, there is the issue about unemployment. And in our paper, we have out of the labor force in the labor force. And, because we have a competitive model and we just don't have a way to think about this notion of I want to work, but I can't work.
Some of that is fixed by the move that we're doing to have the forward-looking agents as in the CDP framework. And that's going to solve some of that. They're still not going to have assets, so that part that you have in your paper is still not going to be there. But yeah, we've been thinking of how to put those assets and
I mean, you don't have to put everything in. I'm just raising questions. You don't have to put everything in here. But it's just like this is kind of a, and like when I thought about this too, is I think that's why I'm impressed by the manufacturing, non-manufacturing wage response. That's the puzzling thing in my head about ADH, is that you have an integrated labor market in a commuting zone or a metro area, and yet one place is moving a lot and one place isn't moving a lot. And that's, again, something that I can't, like, our paper really can't speak to, and you guys can deliver. And that thing is exactly calling out for something funky in the labor market. And so I'm just raising a question about a conceptual issue about the model of labor supply you guys have in your mind. But
a related thing though is that I guess the asset markets can matter a lot for welfare, right? Because if you an insured, and I'm guessing these people in Orange County who lost their jobs didn't really have a lot of assets to begin with, and so they probably weren't leaving the labor force because they had assets they could rely on, and they probably didn't have unemployment. Well, no, they did have unemployment insurance. I guess that is, but they didn't have. They hadn't made state contingent contracts. But that seems like a pretty big issue.
In Mike's paper, what you need is that this decline in. So two things. First of all, notice that in what we're getting is that even places that have a positive terms of trade shock are experiencing unemployment, right? And so this is I mean we have there some analysis that I think clarifies things that I couldn't go through, but you know I think it's the most qualitatively the most important part of our results, right? It's not just amplifying terms of trade effects into getting employment and unemployment effects. It's actually qualitatively reversing what would have been a positive terms of trade shock. If it requires a decline in the nominal wage, then it's going to generate unemployment. And now something that is good is going to turn into something that is bad. And so just getting out, not using the nominal wage rigidity and having a more sophisticated model of the labor supply, I don't know how that's going to deal with that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Like I don't. Yeah, I'd have to think about it.
I think one thing that Andres was bringing up that is very interesting is that people have been emphasizing, and in our paper, we also emphasize the ADH exposure and the effect that that has on employment or not in the labor force. But if we think about this in a frictionless model, the welfare effects and the employment effects would be explained by a net export exposure. That's like a traditional one in trade, not by a labor shares in the Bartik instrument as in ADH. So we actually run our model without the downward nominal wage rigidity, and we get that the net export exposure is relevant and the ADH export exposure is not relevant. And once we put in the downward nominal wage rigidity, is that both of them become relevant. So that is saying the ADH, even the fact that the ADH exposure is relevant for something like wage effects or employment effects could be because of some type of downward nominal wage rigidity. Not necessarily, but it's a candidate. And I find it super interesting.
Sorry, can I come back to the G restriction?
Sorry, my speaker moved to something else. I didn't hear the last part. No.
Yeah, I was wondering if I can come back to the G restriction, to the restriction of the monetary policy. So the way I understand that